Hello there. Every election, politicians, parties, and the media play into the idea that crime and punishment are really serious issues. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at this week in the public gallery. Crime and punishment, or our criminal justice system, is something that shows up every election. It's a really easy hot button issue for politicians and political parties to press when they want to get people worked up and thinking very specifically about how things affect them individually. And it's a really fascinating area to sit down and look at. There are very few people in this country who have not in some way been touched by the criminal justice system. But there's also some really horrific stuff out there around our criminal justice system, like the fact that Māori and Pacifica are well overrepresented in our prison numbers. There's other issues at hand as well when it comes to elections and media. Media basically runs on the motive that if it bleeds, it leads. And so things like gang violence and ram raids and anything worse tends to lead the news, which gives us a really weird kind of social cohesion issue where we might start to think the world is falling to pieces, but the stats don't really make that make sense. It's a tricky area. It doesn't help either when you've got politicians from across the political spectrum who are spreading misinformation around these kind of issues to scare people into voting for them. And a great example of that is what happened in Opotiki a couple of weeks ago with the tangi of a gang leader that was there. Now, he was a community member and he was well known within the community, and the tangi was obviously quite well attended. The media and politicians both ran with the whole town is in lockdown, it's been held ransom kind of narrative. But that's not what the locals on the ground said. It's not what the police there said, and it's not what the mayor of the local town said. That seems really inconsistent, but really designed to make people scared about gangs and about violence and anything else that they can link to that with some undercurrents of racism, because that unfortunately is also kind of a vote getter. Now, I should give you a bit of a heads up about this particular episode. Because we are talking crime, punishment, and the judicial system, there can be some really tough things to listen to here, the stories of the individuals that we're talking to. This week it's Sam, Scout, and Art, and I asked them really specifically what their experiences were within the judicial system. And there's some really hard stuff to listen to. So, just a warning in advance that this one might be a bit of a tough slog to get through. But I think it's really important that we sit down and we listen to different perspectives and we see what other people are seeing and we feel what other people are feeling so that we can get a much better idea as to what needs to change within the criminal justice system. Because that's the one thing that's truly consistent. Nobody agrees that the way things are now works 100%. Nobody can agree, though, on how we actually go about fixing that, or what even fixed looks like. Interestingly, crime and the criminal justice system is actually one of the few topics that we've come across so far that everybody in the gallery that we've spoken to has had some kind of interaction with. They've seen it on the news, read it in the paper, seen it on social media feeds, and it's really one of those topics that ramps up quite a bit as we lead into the election. So, what exactly have they come across when it comes to this year's election rhetoric around crime?
There's a kind of debate exchange between National and Labour, where one side says crime is, not going up, and the other side says crime is going up. Um, uh, and one side's more kind of fantasized about ram raids.
Mostly National and ACT, because the people who vote for them are the people who clutch their pearls the most when it comes to crime. 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be something that affects them. Those people aren't dairy owners. They're executives, that kind of people. They live in like safe communities where the police show up in 10 minutes instead of 2 hours. I've seen National talk about crime. They're talking about getting rid of discounts for sentencing. I think Mark Mitchell was talking about that either yesterday or today.
I noticed that crime seems to be pretty much the only issue that the National Party gives an ass about. I've seen a bit of response to them from the Labour Party, and I've seen a lot of, for instance, the Greens talking about the actual ways that we could do things like reduce our crime rates by reducing poverty. Um, Out of those three biggest parties in the country, I really feel that only the Greens are communicating in a way that's actually going to do anything, and in a way that's not scaremongering.
A couple of National's big policy announcements that they've made over crime and criminal activity are very specifically aimed at punishment for criminals. Those include things like youth boot camps for criminals who are under a certain age and the three strike laws being reinstated. They both have, according to researchers, no real effect in stopping crime whatsoever. Research done by Work and Income actually showed that 90% of all youth offenders who went through the last lot of boot camps reoffended. And Auckland University actually put out a big report on how the three strikes law was a massive failure that really only filled up our prison system without causing any major downturn in the amount of crime or the amount of reoffending. Art has some really strong feelings about these particular issues.
I can tell you some terrible policies, boot camps, crushing people's cars, and those are all national policies. So I can tell you who's got the terrible policies, the dog whistle policies, this will get the blue hairs voting for us because, they had to do military service in 1956. But that's just not the reality now. Do you really want military trained gang members being released back into the public? Cool, let's go send them off to a boot camp where they work out and exercise and become stronger.
Not, not what National is doing, where first need to put young individuals into boot camps, army style boot camps, which what if that's not someone's future? Um, and that's the kind of topic I would want to discuss is eventually in the future is these individuals all have a future, but money could be an issue. Um, their where they grow up could be an issue, and is taking them to an army boot camp something that they ambition to do? Is it something that they inspire to do? Um, Whereas we should be helping these young individuals to help them grow and develop instead of doing bad. Mm.
I have known people who have gone through the 6-week long limited service volunteer course. I've known actually quite a number of people who went through it, and they found it to be a really positive experience. The difference there, though, is that these people made an active choice to go into it. So they went into it expecting to come out with some skills and some benefit to their lives. When we do it as a punishment, and when we take it longer than that 6-week period, we're not going to see that same positive outcome. Most people have met a teenager. Most people know that teenagers are not always amenable to, especially if they're in a bit of a state of crisis, which is causing them to be offending within our criminal justice system. Most teenagers are not going to participate in those sorts of programs to the level that we would need to see a decrease in recidivism.
One of the other problems with something like a three strikes law is that it doesn't really deal with individual issues or circumstances as they arise. And that's something that Sam's really specifically wanting to make sure happens in our criminal justice system. Now, he has never actually been involved in the system itself, but of course he knows people that have. And he's got a recent example of somebody who was hit a lot harder because of where their position is in society, based on a blanket rule approach to how something was actually punished and how that punishment was put in place.
It should be more kind of lenient on those that are not doing as serious crimes. Like failing to stop at a stop sign. Like those people seem to be more prosecuted than the actual individuals who are portraying crime that's more serious. Like for example, robbing a dairy. But in the court system should take uh, robbing a dairy quite serious. Um, I had someone speak to me recently how they accidentally went for a stop sign, and basically they got, a day's worth of income just in that one, that one ticket. And I think it was like, I don't know how many demerit points, I can't remember, sorry, but it was quite a few bob of demerit points, and he was actually an immigrant, so he was fairly new to the country, and he was telling me that there was two officers that ticketed him, but they had a discussion prior to ticketing, that they were going to let him off because he was new to the area, but that happened, and now he has to kind of work, and he's obviously studying too, so he's got to pay for his student loan. I won't say how much it was, but he's got quite a responsibility. He's just trying to make a bit of money and drive to work, and it's just because the student's not earning enough. But I feel like the people that are kind of robbing and such should be prosecuted more. But like I said earlier, there needs to be the process of, are they actually innocent or guilty? Yeah.
The idea of a criminal justice system that can incorporate an individual's circumstances or the circumstances around an event is a really important theme that keeps popping up in the conversations that I had this week. Scout has a really harrowing story about a friend of theirs who actually ended up in prison last year for a crime they didn't commit. The support structures that were in place for them were absolutely woeful. And that's just the beginning.
I am at the point now where I am greeted by name by the security guards at our local courts. They recognise me as I come in because I've been there so often. I have, as I said, I have a very close friend who was involved in the criminal justice system for most of last year, including serving the maximum amount of time in prison for a particular charge. It was a really disorienting process. It was really dehumanizing. It was disorienting. They didn't look at the evidence that they needed to look at to understand the full picture. They weren't interested in the context of the quote unquote offending. And I feel like it was just an inherently flawed process. After they served the maximum amount of time in prison for the charges, and this was on remand, this was not after sentencing. So they were on remand. They served the maximum amount of time. They came home on electronic bail, only in the preparation to sentencing, for the police to drop all the charges. The charge was it sat in the Crimes Act, but it was one of those charges that was not financial, and it didn't involve physically harming anybody. So they used the charge of making a false allegation to emergency services. The problem is that what they alleged was a false allegation was very well recorded in her medical records. And so once the police were submitted a copy of this part of her medical records, which outlined exactly that she was telling the truth with evidence and blood tests and everything to show that she was telling the truth about a particular health condition, they had no choice but to drop the charges. They wouldn't have been able to continue. I don't think that would have happened had our systems worked in a way that protected her and protected her mana up to that point. The media will also often choose to avoid reporting on cases like this in situations where it is actively in court or where the person is actively in a state of crisis. They don't want to do that because that attention we've talked about the comment sections. That attention can be really detrimental to people. The really hard thing is that means we just never talk about it.
At the other end of the criminal justice system, though, is an element that should never be forgotten that often seems to slip through the cracks a little bit. That's the victims. Some crimes don't have a large amount of victims. Some crimes have one or two victims. Their care and their follow-up is really important for a number of psychological reasons, like making sure that they get closure or they know what's going on, they get any kind of help that they need to get. But they don't always seem to be the highest priority of those involved in the criminal justice system. Here's an example from art for you that's a little bit gory.
So when was it? It was right before I moved to Australia. My partner flipped off a guy who was like tailgating us, driving past College Hall. And he like started ramming our car as a result. She pulled over, the guy got out, saw that she was a lady, and decided to start slugging into me. Just like, 2 or 3 real good, like, concussion causing, brain damage making hits. And, I only got away because he tried to choke me, and I got his hand up, and I bit straight through the web of his thumb and ended up with chunks of meat and blood all through my teeth. And that's when he left. Didn't hear anything more about it. And about 3 years later, 4 years later, no, it was after it was 7 years later, I got a message from the police saying, "Hey, there's $500 here if you want it." And that they never told me what the guy was sentenced with. I never got asked if, "Oh, do you oppose what do you call that? Get out of jail free card? Diversion?" Yeah, yeah, diversion. Like, I never got asked any process at any step in the process was I ever asked. Pretty much he did the crime, they got him straight away and left him at home because he was 16 years old, and I got $500 out of it for brain damage.
Fascinatingly, the difference between where Art lives in Hamilton West and where Sam lives in Dunedin, there is a massive difference in the amount of crime that's going on, which gives you a massive difference in how people perceive what's actually happening. For Art, he is in one of the highest crime areas in the country. In the last 12 months, there were 704 reported break ins, 345 of those in a retail setting. Whereas for Sam, there was 45 for the whole year, and that includes car break-ins, which is what the public perception is around crime at the moment in the area.
Crime doesn't really affect me, but there is a lot of robberies as of late happening around Dunedin, typically St. Clair area, um, around the kind of south kind of Dunedin area, and Māori Hill around that area. Just car break-ins typically, and I don't think the police are really acting and trying to protect communities around here, which is quite interesting to me, and it is getting close to home, but yeah, it is sort of making me concerned, but I'm not affected.
Of course, one of the outcomes of a punitive justice system like the one that we have is people get sent to prison. And that can be, well, quite harrowing depending on who you are, what you're dealing with, what you're in there for. There's a whole bunch of factors that really feed into what somebody's time in prison is going to be like. And there's real concerns from a large number of people that prisons are essentially just a training ground to make people better criminals.
Sure, we could lock everyone up. We could lock up everyone who's got a gang patch on. It's not going to solve anything. It's going to cost a lot of money. But yeah, mostly it won't solve anything. And you start locking up teenagers. Cool. Next thing you know, 10-year-olds are doing ram raids, even though I think one already has. And you lock those kids up. The criminal element will just keep recruiting younger and younger and younger. It doesn't matter who you lock up, how long you lock them up for. I've heard prison described as a training school for crime, and it is. Like, I have a family member who came out, knew how to cook meth. Like, and before that, he was just like a burglar of cars. But then when he came out, he was, suddenly a top level criminal associate. So yeah, locking people up is never going to work. It sounds great.
To try and combat the idea of prisons being a training ground for better criminals, restorative justice is a technique that's designed to make criminals see what they've done wrong, and think about others, teaching them empathy and helping them reconnect with maybe elements of their personality or their humanity or their ideologies, their spirituality that they haven't really connected with in a while. And for a lot of people, they don't see those elements really being brought into how prisons currently work.
A lot more use of restorative justice processes, um, a lot more avoidance of actually putting people in prison. I've seen people go to prison over the last couple of years who were not a harm to society, were more a risk to themselves, and it was really detrimental for them to be in prison. Um, there's not adequate mental health support in prison, and when you come out of prison, you're left with massive amounts of debt for all of the bills that, for instance, you couldn't pay while you were in prison, or um, the cost of getting back on your feet, getting into housing, getting into support.
There's a lot of research out there as well about Māori in prisons. Now, research from Dr. Will Flavel showed really specifically that young people who are given a really solid education are far less likely to be involved in any kind of criminal activity when they get older. But for prisoners that are already within the system who identify as Māori, finding a connection to Te Ao Māori is a really important step that generally sees them reconnect with places like their iwi, their hapu, and their rohi. Sam had a really fascinating experience in a holding cell in Wellington, where they'd just installed a range of tukutuku and popo patterns within the holding cell, and he got a chance to talk to one of the individuals that was on hold in there waiting for sentencing.
Well, if we implement Māori ideology, especially because prison populations do have a significant amount of Māori, because they come from a lower decile uh, area or grow up in that lower decile kind of living situation. And I'm not trying to be racist here, but Maori programs and introducing culture kind of allows them to spiritually connect to their communities, connect to who they are and why they're here. Where do they belong, and kind of a sense of community allows one to be develop developmental when it comes to ideas and thinking about actions. And I do think that I mean, I don't see much Maori kind of culture or Maori kind of presentation when it comes to prisons. It's more kind of substandard, general kind of ideas. I do think that we shouldn't just be rebuilding their developments and trades. We should be rebuilding their developments in other areas, not just kind of road working or that kind of type of industry. I feel like that's not connecting individuals. It's just putting them into a shit position. Got a tour of the Wellington City prison, like it's all underground. Like for the police station, it's not. I don't think it's an actual prison, but like like jail cells and stuff. And it's quite interesting. Um, just getting a tour of it, kind of getting the hang of how they kind of cooperate with things. And one thing that struck me, and I'm glad you asked that question because uh, the whole idea of me visiting was to view cultural artwork that was implemented into the prison walls, which they had said it kind of reduced the anxiety of coming into a big concrete area, rather on the walls, inside the prison areas. It was all kind of design, and artistic design, and it kind of made someone feel at peace. And um, I spoke to someone that was there. They managed to let me do that, and I was quite surprised. I didn't know the guy's name, but it was a great discussion because he felt kind of comfortable being in there, until he can be processed and discharged. Um, and I asked him one question. I said, how do you feel being here and for what you did? And he said, he did regret it, but everyone has been kind of nice and respectful to that individual. And I do think introducing kind of moral or morals uh, into a situation like that, um, into an area like that is kind of developmental. Yeah.
We like to think that systems like prisons and the justice system as a whole is set up to break a cycle of crime. But realistically, the structures are not in place to make that happen. Do you know exactly what happens when you get out of prison, for example? The system is not set up to help you unless you've already got a support structure in place. And for a number of people, that's not what happens. They need help to be able to get back up on their feet and get back into the community. And that help is incredibly slim on the ground. And because it's so hard to come by, because it is so financially restrictive, in many ways it's funneling people back into those criminal systems. That keeps the cycle going and going.
They potentially don't have any housing, they don't have access to money. The Steps to Freedom grant is like $350. And it's been that way for over a decade. And so people are coming out of prison, they're being given a Steps to Freedom grant. That $350 is their money to get a house, to feed themselves, to, I don't know, get a cell phone so that they can communicate with their loved ones. It's absolutely bonkers to me that we don't have enough supports in place. There are places like halfway houses, for instance, for people who are coming out of prison who have done certain types of crimes. But down here in the South, we don't have access to those for women. We only have access to those for men. So there are all of these people that will be going to prison under the 3 strikes law. They'll potentially lose their house, they'll lose their jobs, they'll lose things like their credit scores because they'll be left in debt from bills that they won't be able to pay while they're in prison. I've seen people lose things like their place on an ACC waiting list. They lose their GP if they're sent to a different region because you get enrolled in a different primary health organisation, and then you come home and you can't even get access to a GP. So $350 is not enough to do that. And then, you know, if we are putting people in prison on the 3rd strike, we also don't have enough space in our prisons. We already have prisons that are so full that people are actively trying to stop arresting people in some regions because they can't fit any more people into their prisons.
The criminal justice system as it stands at the moment is far from perfect. There are very few, if any, people out there that would be willing to say that the way it is now works. But nobody can agree on what we need to do to fix it, because fixing it implies that there is a way to make it work. And ideally, you want a criminal justice system that doesn't have that many criminals in it. You want to stop people from falling into that sort of lifestyle or doing those sort of activities. You really want to make sure that people are being kept safe and supported. It's a big, complicated Rubik's Cube of an issue that we're not going to get a really fast, easy answer to. So quick fire suggestions from politicians about building more prisons or locking people up after 3rd strikes or sending kids to boot camps, they're never going to be the answer. And it doesn't matter which political party puts it forward. Nobody is going to be able to fix this problem until we look at systemic issues that cause people to lead a life of crime and how we go about fixing those people once they're involved in the system and making sure they don't fall back into that life of crime. And that's not an easy issue to fix either. That's it. That's the end of this episode of The Public Gallery. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget you can download other episodes wherever it is that you're getting your podcast from, or you could watch it on YouTube. There's a video version. My hair's not done. I apologize in advance for that. Don't forget to join us next week for our next episode. We're going to be talking to the other half of our gallery about memes, the internet. Who does it well? What effect does it have on people when it comes to their decision-making process? And is it really all that controversial if a political party uses something like AI to create artwork? Join us next week here on The Public Gallery.